Maya Carter walked through the glass doors of the airport with purpose. The early morning sun filtered through the large windows, casting a golden glow over the polished floors. She had just returned from a national security summit, where she had met with law enforcement officials from across the country, discussing new strategies for combating domestic terrorism. As the newly appointed director of the FBI, her career had always been a series of calculated steps toward breaking barriers and leading with integrity. But today, those steps would lead her to a different kind of fight. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice called from behind. Maya turned, expecting a simple request for her boarding pass or ID, but instead, the tone was sharp and unfriendly. "Yes," Maya said, her voice steady but curious. "You're going to need to come with us?" The security officer repeated, his hand extending out toward her, motioning toward a small side room. Maya's brow furrowed, her instincts immediately on alert. She had been through countless security checks as the director of the FBI. There was never an issue, never a question. The idea that she would be detained here, in an airport of all places, felt utterly absurd. "I'm the director of the FBI," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. "I don't believe you need my identification. Do you?" The officer's gaze flickered for a brief moment before he raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "We have our procedures. Please, just follow me." The words hung in the air, each syllable dripping with something that Maya couldn't quite put her finger on, something that felt far from ordinary. Maya knew the drill. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with people who underestimated her based on her gender, her race, or the expectations that people projected onto her. But this felt different. This wasn't just a routine check. There was something far more insidious at play. They led her to a small room off to the side of the terminal, with drab beige walls and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. 2 officers were already waiting for her. Both young, both looking uncomfortable, as if they knew something was wrong but didn't know how to address it. Maya took a breath, trying to maintain her composure. "What is this about?" she asked, standing tall. "We just need to verify a few things," one of the officers said, not looking her in the eye. "We were told there was a potential security concern." Maya's fingers tightened around her suitcase handle, resisting the urge to let frustration boil over. "A security concern? Are you telling me that the director of the FBI, someone who was just briefed on classified national security matters, is a threat?" For a long moment, there was silence. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before the second officer spoke, his voice low. "We're just following orders. Don't make this difficult." Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, but her training kicked in. She stayed calm, choosing her next words carefully. "I'm asking, I'm demanding that you contact your supervisor. You can check my identification, my records, anything you need. But this is a mistake, and you know it." But the officer hesitated, and for the first time, Maya saw it real fear, deep fear flickering behind his eyes. It wasn't fear of her, but of the potential fallout that would come if they admitted the truth. That they were detaining her, a black woman in power, with no valid reason. She saw it in their eyes now. The doubt, the discomfort, the quietly simmering prejudice. They didn't believe she belonged here. They didn't believe that she could be who she said she was. In that instant, she understood. Maya pulled out her phone, prepared to make the call that would end this situation. But before she could dial, one of the officers spoke again. "You can leave," he said, his voice low. "But you'll need to go through another round of checks first." Maya's frustration flared, but she controlled it. Another round of checks? For what reason? The officer didn't answer. His face remained unreadable, but she could feel the thinly veiled hostility in the air. He handed her a piece of paper, a form she was sure she'd never seen before. A form that was designed to be more an obstacle than a procedure. She looked at the form, noting how the language was vague, almost intentionally so. It didn't make sense. There was no legal justification for detaining her this way, no security risk she posed. The longer she stood there, the clearer it became. They were trying to discredit her. They were making it difficult to ensure they could claim she wasn't who she said she was. Maya's mind raced, analyzing her options. She could escalate this. She could demand they contact someone higher up, call for an immediate release. But she knew the consequences. If she made it public now, it would ignite a firestorm. She would be painted as a troublemaker, a diva, as someone who was too powerful for her own good. They would twist this. They would twist her. But then a thought crossed her mind. What if this wasn't just about her? What if it was about every other person who had been silently, invisibly detained, treated like an outsider because of who they were, how they looked, where they came from? She was at the precipice. If she chose to stay silent, she would save herself. But if she chose to fight back, she would risk everything. And in that moment, Maya knew what she had to do. "I'm done with this," Maya said quietly, her voice full of authority. She stepped toward the officer, closer now, her body poised and calm, but her eyes blazed with determination. "You don't have the right to detain me. I am the director of the FBI. You need to stop wasting my time." The officers flinched as her words landed, the weight of them palpable. "Do you know what you're doing?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Do you understand what it means when people like you use their power to suppress someone like me?" Before they could respond, Maya turned toward the door, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. She was done being patient. She was done playing by their rules. As she reached for the door, the officer nearest to her stepped forward, blocking her way. "I'm afraid I can't let you leave, ma'am. You've caused enough of a scene already." Maya's heart raced. She knew this was going to escalate, but she couldn't back down now. "Is this how it ends?" Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you honestly think you can stop me from doing my job? From protecting this country?" The officer's face twisted, his hand reaching out to restrain her. Maya stepped back, her hands held out in front of her, her composure slowly cracking. But before she could react, the door behind her slammed open. A senior officer entered, his eyes darting between the scene in front of him. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice low but with a definite authority. Maya turned to him, her face like stone. "Yes," she replied. "There's a problem, and it's time we talk about it." As the senior officer looked at her, his eyes widened, and for the briefest moment, it seemed as though the power had shifted. Maya Carter was no longer just a woman detained. She was a symbol, and this fight was only just beginning. Maya Carter stood still, facing the senior officer who had just entered the small, sterile room. The noise of the airport, the bustling crowd outside, felt distant now, like a faint hum. The fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, but none of that mattered. This was a fight for something far greater than the inconvenience of her detainment. This was a fight for recognition of her power, her place, and her worth. The senior officer's eyes flickered with a mix of caution and calculation. He wasn't here by coincidence. Maya could feel it, the tension in the air, the weight of something unsaid hanging between them. "Is there a problem here?" he asked again, his voice calm, but the underlying edge was impossible to ignore. Maya didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied his face, assessing whether this would be the turning point or just another step toward deeper injustice. The officers around her seemed to shrink, unsure of what to do next. Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. "There's a serious problem here, officer," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm being detained under false pretenses, and you know it." The officer glanced briefly at the two younger agents, his expression betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Do you have any idea what you're implicating here?" he asked. His tone was more controlled now, but the question carried an unspoken threat. Maya's heart pounded, but she met his gaze head-on. "I'm implicating a system that's been broken for far too long," she replied. "A system that thinks my authority is less valid because of who I am, where I come from, and what I look like." The officer didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly. "We need to resolve this quietly. This could escalate in ways you don't want." "I'm already past quietly," Maya said. "You have one chance to fix this." Maya was escorted out of the small room by the senior officer, still flanked by the younger agents who had initially detained her. Their steps echoed in the hallway, each one heavier than the last. As they neared the exit, Maya could feel the eyes of the passengers around her. She was still the director of the FBI, but in this moment, she was something else, a symbol of resistance, a woman who had dared to stand against a system that wanted to silence her. When they finally reached the main terminal, the senior officer stopped. "We're letting you go," he said, his words clipped, like he had just handed her a reprieve. Maya didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing, calculating her next move. She wanted to call it quits, to leave the airport and forget this ever happened. But she knew that if she walked away now, nothing would change. The world would continue to see her as a threat, not because of her position or her accomplishments, but because of the color of her skin. And that was something she couldn't just walk away from. "I'm not leaving here without a proper explanation," Maya said, her voice rising slightly. "I want to speak to your superior, someone who can answer for this." The officer hesitated. "You don't want to do that. Not here, not now." Maya stepped forward, her resolve hardening. "Yes, I do. And I'm not leaving until I have that conversation." She could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the pressure of an unspoken mandate pushing him in one direction while his duty as an officer of the law tugged him in another. Finally, he nodded, but his eyes were narrowed, calculating. "Fine, but be careful what you ask for." Maya was led to a back office, where she was left alone for several minutes. Her mind spun as she stood there, taking in the sterile, white walls. She had been in situations like this before, stripped of her power, forced to fight back against a system that wanted to undermine her. But this time it was personal. This wasn't just about making a point. This was about her dignity, her right to exist in spaces where her presence wasn't questioned. As she waited, she reflected on her earlier thoughts, the prejudices that had followed her throughout her career. She had learned to rise above them. But today, the weight of it all had almost broken her. Almost, but not quite. The door opened with a sharp click. In stepped the airport's director of security, a man in his late 50s, wearing a crisp uniform and carrying the air of someone accustomed to power. He didn't even look at her as he sat down, instead folding his hands in front of him on the desk. "You wanted to talk," he said, his voice cold, detached. "Yes," Maya said, her voice controlled. But the anger bubbling beneath the surface was impossible to hide. "I want an apology, and I want you to fix this. Not just for me, but for everyone else who has faced this kind of treatment and never had the chance to stand up for themselves." The director leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're making a mistake, Carter," he said, his eyes now meeting hers. "You're asking for something that doesn't belong to you." "I'm not asking for anything," Maya said, her voice suddenly icy. "I'm demanding what is rightfully mine, the same respect anyone else would get in my position." The director remained silent for a long moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, he spoke again. "This isn't about respect. This is about perception. Your kind doesn't command authority here." Maya's heart dropped. The words were cold, but they rang with the bitter truth of what she had known all along. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a calculated act of bias, a reflection of the systemic racism that ran deeper than anyone cared to acknowledge. "I am authority," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'll make sure you understand that. I won't stop until you do." Maya's fight was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, and silenced. She knew that her next steps would be monumental. She couldn't just report this incident and walk away. She had to expose the deeper, more insidious layers of bias that existed within every institution. She had to be the change she wanted to see. Over the next few days, Maya began working tirelessly behind the scenes. She collected statements, spoke to witnesses, and began piecing together a narrative that would expose the truth. But as she worked, she realized just how deep the rot went. The airport, it seemed, wasn't the only institution where prejudice festered. Every corner of society had its biases, its quiet assumptions about people like her, people who didn't fit the mold. But Maya was determined to turn this into something more. She began building a coalition, people who had been affected by prejudice and discrimination, people who understood the weight of systemic bias. She reached out to lawyers, activists, journalists, people who could help her take the story to the national stage. However, the deeper she dug, the more resistance she faced. Information was hidden, stories were dismissed, and every time she thought she was getting closer to the truth, another obstacle was thrown in her path. One night, as Maya sat in her office, reviewing files and reports, her phone rang. She answered, and the voice on the other end was familiar, but the words were anything but comforting. "Maya, we need to talk. Now. They're coming for you." Before she could respond, the line went dead. A chill ran down Maya's spine. She didn't need to ask who they were. It was the same people who had tried to keep her silent. The same people who believed that someone like her didn't belong in positions of power. Maya stared at the phone, her mind racing. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about dismantling an entire system that had been built to keep people like her down. Maya grabbed her coat, slipping it on with a determination that burned like fire. She wasn't going to let this story end in the shadows. She wasn't going to let herself be silenced. As she made her way out of her office, a knock at the door froze her in place. "Knock! Knock!" She opened it. Standing there, with an unreadable expression, was someone she didn't expect, a figure who had the power to change everything. "Are you ready to fight?" the figure asked, their voice calm, yet charged with unspoken urgency. Maya's heart pounded as she nodded. "Then let's make them see," she said, stepping into the unknown. The door closed behind her, and the battle began. Maya Carter stood in the dark, her breath steady but her heart racing. The voice on the other end of the line had gone silent after the unsettling words. "They're coming for you." Now, standing in the hallway outside her office, she felt the weight of the world pushing against her chest. She had expected resistance, but not like this. Every step she had taken to expose the deep-seated biases within the system now felt like a trigger for a storm that was already brewing. But that storm? It was about to break wide open. She wasn't going to be silenced. Not this time. Not by anyone. Maya walked briskly down the hallway, her thoughts racing faster than her feet. The file on her desk was an explosion of truths that could shake the very foundations of the system she had dedicated her life to. The detainment at the airport had been more than just a personal insult. It had been a symbol of something much larger, a reflection of how power could be manipulated to oppress. She needed to prepare. The system wasn't just going to roll over and admit fault. No, it had long been in place to protect itself, not justice. Maya had seen it before in smaller acts of prejudice, in the way people of color, especially women, were never truly seen for the power they held. She was done letting this slip by. She had to act. First, she needed a plan. The first thing Maya did was contact the few people she could trust. Her most reliable assistant, Kelly, had been with her for years, and she knew that Kelly would understand the gravity of the situation. As she dialed Kelly's number, the sound of the ringing felt like an eternity. When Kelly finally picked up, Maya didn't waste time. "Kelly, we need to get everything we have on this airport incident," Maya said, her voice low but urgent. "I need every witness, every statement, and I need it now." "On it," Kelly replied instantly. Maya could hear the swift tapping of keys in the background. "I'll gather everything. Do you want me to call in a lawyer?" "No time for that," Maya said. "We're not going through the usual channels. We need to move fast." Within minutes, Kelly had gathered all the necessary files. She was quick, efficient. But Maya's mind was already racing ahead. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to click together. But she knew this wasn't just about an apology. This was bigger, much bigger. Maya sat down at her desk and started to sift through the reports Kelly had sent. The names, the dates, the inconsistencies. But there was something that stood out to her. A subtle manipulation of information. One of the officers who had detained her, Officer Daniels, had filed a report that was glaringly different from the truth. The report painted her as aggressive, as difficult to deal with, even implying that she had caused a disturbance. Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just bias. This was a deliberate attempt to fabricate a narrative that would discredit her. "Kelly," Maya said, dialing her assistant again. "There's something wrong with Officer Daniels' report. It's been twisted. They're trying to rewrite what happened." "Got it," Kelly responded quickly. I'll start digging into his background. Maya hung up, staring at the report in front of her. She had to get ahead of this before it spiraled. She knew the media was already getting wind of the situation, and if the wrong story got out, her career could be over. It wasn't just her reputation on the line, this was about the power dynamics at play, the systemic biases that she knew ran deeper than anyone was willing to admit. She needed allies, people who could help her expose the lies. But trust was hard to come by when the system was so heavily rigged. 2 days passed before Maya heard from her unexpected ally. She was in the middle of a strategy meeting when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the message was clear. You're not alone. Meet me at the usual spot. Maya didn't hesitate. She knew exactly who this was. Julian Morrow, an investigative journalist who had been following her career for years. He had always been on the outside, reporting on the kind of stories that made powerful people uncomfortable. Maya had met him once at a conference, and they had exchanged a few words about the way race and power were manipulated by those at the top. When she arrived at the old coffee shop, Julian was already seated in the back corner. His expression was grim, his eyes scanning the room. When he saw her, he stood up and motioned for her to sit. "I've been looking into Officer Daniels," he said without preamble. "Turns out he's got a history of misconduct, mostly overlooked. But what's more troubling? His ties to people in high places." Maya narrowed her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this goes higher than just a few rogue officers. It's not just one bad apple. This is systemic," Julian said. "And the whole thing is being covered up." Maya felt a chill run through her. She had suspected as much, but hearing it from someone like Julian, someone who had the resources to dig into it, made it all the more real. She leaned forward, her voice low. "How high are we talking?" Julian didn't flinch. "High enough to cover their tracks. High enough to control the narrative." Maya took a breath. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. She was no longer just fighting for justice for herself. She was up against an entire system that had learned to manipulate truth and control power for its own benefit. But now she had a weapon: information. "Help me expose this," Maya said, her voice hardening with resolve. "Together we'll take it down." As the investigation gained traction, Maya's every move was monitored. She could feel the weight of invisible eyes on her, always watching, always waiting for her to slip. But every time she felt the tension rise, she pressed harder. She worked tirelessly, meeting with Julian to go over new leads, speaking with whistleblowers who had begun to come forward. The deeper she dug, the more she realized just how entrenched the corruption was. But it wasn't just the external pressure that weighed on her. It was the psychological toll, the constant questioning of her authority, her place in this battle. At every turn, there were people ready to dismiss her, ready to reduce her to just another angry woman of color challenging the system. The subtle bias was everywhere, in the way people spoke to her, in the looks they gave her, in the doors that were closed to her. One afternoon, as Maya walked into a meeting with senior government officials, she noticed the difference in their reception. The tone had shifted. They weren't looking at her as the FBI director anymore. They were looking at her as an inconvenience, a threat they didn't want to acknowledge. "Director Carter," one of them said, his voice smooth but condescending. "It's been quite the spectacle, hasn't it? What exactly are you hoping to achieve with this investigation?" Maya paused, her gaze cold. "I'm hoping to achieve justice," she said, her voice low and controlled, "for everyone who's ever been forced to submit to a system that wasn't built for them." The official's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Justice," he repeated. "A noble cause. But don't get too carried away, Director. There's more at stake here than you realize." Maya didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. But now there was something different. She had the power to make them listen, to make them uncomfortable with the truth. Maya's momentum was building, but with every victory came a new roadblock. A final push was coming, she could feel it. She had gathered the evidence, she had the allies, but the system was not going to let her go easily. The media had begun to pick up the story, but the narrative was being twisted, manipulated. She could already hear the whispers. "She's just out for revenge. She's disgruntled. She's too emotional to lead. Then, late one night, Kelly called. They've started coming after us, Maya, Kelly said, her voice shaking. They've started attacking our credibility. They're trying to discredit everything we've done. The media is turning on you. Maya's heart sank. This was what she had feared. Her battle wasn't just with the people who detained her. It was with the entire machinery of power that protected itself through manipulation, distortion, and control. But she couldn't stop now. Not when she had come so far. We're not done yet, Maya said firmly, her voice steady despite the rising tide of fear. We expose them now. No more games. As Maya prepared for the final confrontation, a call came through. It was Julian, his voice filled with urgency. Maya, I've got something big. You need to see it now. Maya's heart pounded as she grabbed her coat, her mind racing with what Julian had found. This was it, the moment that could change everything. Meet me at the usual spot, Julian said, his voice cutting through the tension. Maya didn't waste a second. She ran. The storm was coming, and this time, she was ready to face it head-on. Maya Carter's heart raced as she hurried through the dark streets, the echo of her hurried footsteps matching the pulse of her mind. The weight of the message from Julian still hung heavy in her chest. I've got something big. You need to see it now. The wind bit at her skin, but Maya barely noticed it as she rounded the corner toward the coffee shop where she'd met Julian just days ago. Her thoughts swirled, each one competing for her attention. Her career, her reputation, the investigation, they were all on the line, and now Julian was promising a breakthrough. It had to be. There was no other choice. She entered the coffee shop and immediately scanned the dimly lit interior. Julian was sitting at their usual table in the back corner, a laptop open in front of him. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with the intensity of the information he had to share. As Maya approached, he closed the laptop with a decisive snap and looked at her with urgency. Maya, this is it, Julian said, his voice low. You need to see this. Maya took the seat across from Julian, her eyes scanning his face for any clue about what was coming. Julian wasn't one for dramatics, he was a no-nonsense kind of journalist. If he was reacting this strongly, whatever he had found was explosive. Look, Julian said, pulling up a file on his phone and turning the screen toward Maya. I've been digging into Officer Daniels, and it's worse than I thought. This isn't just about one officer. It's about a network of people who have been systematically erasing, covering up, and denying the work of people like you. People who challenge the status quo. Maya took the phone and stared at the screen. The file Julian had gathered revealed shocking details. There were financial ties between Daniels and several high-ranking officials in government, people who had worked to suppress the narratives of people of color in powerful positions. There was even a direct link to one of the biggest lobbying groups in the country, a group known for pushing policies that protected law enforcement from public accountability. Are you telling me that Daniels is connected to all of this? Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The implications were staggering. It wasn't just about a single officer. It was a network of people actively working to suppress the truth, to perpetuate a cycle of injustice. It's bigger than that, Julian said, his voice tightening. The connections run deep and it goes all the way to the top. It's not just the police. It's in the courts, in the media, in the laws. The system is designed to keep you down, Maya, and they're terrified of what will happen if you expose them. Maya's mind was spinning. She had known the system was broken, but this was a revelation that changed everything. The road ahead would not only be about defending herself, it would be about taking down an entire network that had protected its interests by any means necessary. The question was, how could she do it? How could one person expose such an entrenched system? She looked up at Julian, determination hardening in her gaze. We take this to the people. We get the truth out. Over the next few days, Maya and Julian worked tirelessly, gathering information, reaching out to trusted allies, and piecing together the full scope of the conspiracy. But they weren't just collecting data, they were preparing for a fight. They knew that if they exposed what they had learned, it would spark an explosion. The media would pick it up, and the backlash would be fierce. But Maya was no stranger to adversity. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a case of one corrupt officer, it was an entire infrastructure built on maintaining the status quo, suppressing any challenge to the power of the few. But Maya knew that the only way forward was to take the fight to the very heart of the beast. The first step was to confront the media. Julian had connections with a few key journalists, people who had followed his work on systemic injustice for years. Maya agreed to sit down with them for an exclusive interview, her first public declaration of what was really going on behind the scenes. As she sat across from the journalists in a makeshift press conference room, the weight of what she was about to do settled heavily on her shoulders. But she was determined. She was no longer the victim of a mistake. She was the leader of a movement. She could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in the way the reporters looked at her. They were starting to see her not just as an FBI director, but as a woman who had the power to change things. The system has been built to protect the powerful. Maya began, her voice unwavering. It has been built on lies, on manipulation, on the belief that some people are more valuable than others. What happened to me in that airport is not just my story. It's the story of every single person who has been silenced, overlooked, or oppressed because of their race, their gender, or their position in society. I will not be silenced. Maya's statement made headlines within hours. The pressure was building. She could feel it in every interaction, every meeting. People were starting to take sides. Some were applauding her bravery, while others were circling the wagons, preparing to discredit her. But the pushback was already starting to form. The same people who had once overlooked her now found ways to attack her credibility. They questioned her judgment. They claimed she was out of her depth. They painted her as a radical, a troublemaker who had overstepped her bounds. But Maya didn't flinch. She knew what she had to do. Her next move was to call a meeting with the highest levels of law enforcement. She needed them to hear the truth. She needed them to see the danger in what they were allowing to happen. As she walked into the meeting, the tension was palpable. The room was filled with senior officials, people who had the power to either support her or bury her efforts. Maya stood tall, her mind focused. The time for politeness was over. It was time to confront them. The truth is, Maya began, this institution is rotten. It's been rotting for years. The biases, the corruption, the manipulation, it all starts at the top. You cannot claim to be a defender of justice when you're turning a blind eye to the people who are in power. You can't claim to protect the people if you're protecting the system that oppresses them. There was silence. The officials exchanged glances, but none spoke. Maya's words hung heavy in the room. The time for silence is over, she continued. We have to act. If we want to preserve the integrity of this nation, we have to expose what's been happening. We cannot allow this to continue. One of the senior officials, a man Maya had known for years, finally spoke. You're treading dangerous ground, Director Carter. You're making enemies that you don't want to make. Maya met his gaze, unwavering. I'm not making enemies. I'm making allies. I'm making sure that this system isn't allowed to continue. The public outcry grew as more and more people began to rally behind Maya's cause. Whistleblowers came forward, journalists picked up the story, and a movement started to gain momentum. But the resistance wasn't just coming from law enforcement. The political elite, the corporations, the very structure of power that Maya was fighting to expose, fought back with everything they had. They attacked her personal life, her professional reputation, even her integrity. They tried to paint her as unstable, as someone who was using her position for personal gain. But with each attack, Maya only grew stronger. She was no longer just a woman fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. The final showdown came when a high-profile trial began, a trial where Maya was called to testify against the corrupt officials who had orchestrated the cover-up. The courtroom was packed. The eyes of the nation focused on her. The tension was suffocating. Maya took the stand, and for the first time she felt the weight of everything she had worked for. This was at the moment where everything would either come crashing down or be rebuilt from the ashes. As Maya testified, her voice unwavering, The truth spilled out in powerful waves. She had gathered everything: proof, testimonies, documents, and laid it all bare. The system had tried to silence her, tried to discredit her, but now the truth was undeniable. The officials who had once held power were now on the defensive. They tried to twist the facts, to shift the blame, but Maya had the evidence. She had the people, and she had the truth. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours. Maya sat in silence, her heart pounding, waiting for the verdict. When the jury returned, the courtroom was hushed. The foreman stood, and in a voice that rang with finality, he said, "Guilty." The room erupted in applause, but Maya's eyes remained fixed on the judge. This was her victory, but it was more than that. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been held down by the system. It was a victory for justice. As Maya walked out of the courthouse, she felt the weight of the battle lift. She had done it. The system had been exposed. The fight was far from over, but this was a victory that would resonate for years to come. She turned to Julian, who had been by her side through it all. "We did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Julian smiled, his eyes shining. "No, Maya, you did it." Maya looked up at the sky, the sun setting behind the buildings. She had fought for justice, for herself, and for everyone who had been oppressed. And in the end, the truth had won. As Maya stood there, victorious, she knew this battle was just the beginning. There were still countless others who needed to be heard, countless systems that needed to be dismantled. But for now, she had achieved what seemed impossible. This is where we all come in. The fight against prejudice and systemic injustice isn't over. If you believe in the power of truth, if you believe in the need for change, join the movement. Stand with those who are fighting to make the world a better, more just place. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. Stand up. Speak out. The fight for justice begins with you.